Hi, and welcome to this episode of Veriff Voices. I'm Peter Murray, Head of Gaming here at Veriff, and today we're talking to someone in the gaming industry with a particularly interesting story to tell. A keen advocate for both diversity and the gaming industry, Micky Swindale is currently Global Head of Sales Enablement, a partner and very much part of KPMG's global gaming team. And she's a big champion for diversity and inclusion, including the We All Want to Play initiative. We normally start with telling us a bit about your background, but you want to tell us where you do now, because I've got a list in front of me of what your current jobs are. So tell us about exactly where you are, job-wise, etc., career-wise right now.
Absolutely. Things have changed for me quite a bit this year in the last couple of months, because having for a long time lived on the Isle of Man, I've moved to London, to the big smoke. That's a big difference. And I've actually moved out of, having been with the KPMG Islands group for a long time, I've now moved to KPMG in the UK in order to do a global role for KPMG.
So what does that global role involve? Because I think anybody who's certainly dealt with me or you over the years in the sector, we do knows what you did. How does that job differ from what you've done before? What does it involve?
I guess the gaming sector for some years now, having been my core job, has sort of become a side gig in that, for the last 5 years, I was COO and head of markets for the KPMG Islands group. But I continued to devote a good 20% of my time to working with the global gaming team to help us win work, build relationships, organize events like the KPMG summits, those kind of things. And I will continue to do exactly the same in this new role. But the new role, I can completely understand why you would ask, because it's one of those titles where people go, so Global Head of Sales Enablement, Peter. I've tried translating it for a few people, and my favourite way of translating it is that I'm just helping other people to be a bit more showy-offy, and I think being showy-offy is one of my skills. So it's really about KPMG and how we interact with our clients and building client relationships, always putting the client first. A lot of the things that I know you're keen to talk about in terms of how we have relationships with the people that we provide services to, whether it's Veriff, KPMG, or the gaming sector.
I think it's interesting when you put the word sales in there. I get the same thing with trying to get my wife to explain what head of gaming is. When all my kids think of is, I don't know, Roblox or Epic Games or whatever. The title can mean whatever you want it to be. And mine sounds similar. Mine's very much to pull various different parts of the business together to deliver for the client. And ultimately, whatever we do, it's that. So I guess the biggest change, I was going to say the biggest change in this job might be travel, but I don't think so, judging by the travel you generally do.
Well, pre-pandemic, you're right. I mean, I did loads of travel because the KPMG Islands group covered such a big area, so not just Malta, Gibraltar. Well, actually, Gibraltar became part of the UK firm relatively quickly, which is good from my point of view. But Malta, the Crown dependencies, including the Isle of Man, but then Bermuda and right the way through the Caribbean, which, people have been forgiven for saying to me a number of times over the years, so you stayed on the Isle of Man rather than moving to one of these islands? But it worked out very well for us, because for the sort of time that I spent in the Caribbean, generally we would base ourselves in Miami, and my lovely husband Paul would just be in Miami and kind of, become a bro in Miami and live his life there while I was island hopping. So he was pretty happy with that.
Yeah, I think some of us call that freeloading, I think. If I ever meet him one day, I will refuse to bring that up.
Yes, quite right.
I mean, you've been there since 97 or something at KPMG?
Yeah, I know. 25 years. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, very quickly, I went back into audit, because pretty much everyone trains in audit. Not everyone, but most. Went back into audit. Another 6 years on from then, I moved out into advisory and into people and change. But I guess the really key move was that we set up a business development group sort of probably around 2003, 2004. I was the youngest person and most junior person in the organisation that was included in that. And I became head of targeting. And the big target for me was just around the time that the gaming sector was at its very early stages of establishing in the Isle of Man. And I went to RMD, David McGarry, RMD at the time, and said to him, this is our target. This is the sector that we want to work with. And if we want to work with them, we need to be all in. We need to learn about them. We need to help other people learn about them. We need to show them that we support them and we believe in them and we want to be their preferred provider, because it's not something you do by halves. And he, fortunately for me, completely agreed. And that was the beginning of kind of everything, the summits, everything.
Because that is interesting, because I think if you look at certain sectors, the gambling sector would carry a certain amount of risk. Maybe that's not quite the right word, but nervousness about going, like the banks, etc. in the US. What do you think it was at that time that KPMG went, yeah, let's do this?
I think David, like me, was, and I think probably anyone that is in a jurisdiction in the Isle of Man or Cayman, there's a lot of perceptions around islands like this, and rightly so in many ways, because I mean, I don't know if you've been watching the Brinks-Matt series recently, Gold, but when you see how some of the sort of low tax independent jurisdictions are shown and undoubtedly did behave at that time, it's horrifying to watch. But things have changed dramatically, and they really are transparent and whiter than white. And so we were very used to the fact that perception can be very different to reality, and that you have to really work together to show how you behave as a jurisdiction or as an industry. And so that there was, I think, a lot of parallels in that we understood that it's very easy to be depicted as the villain by people who don't necessarily understand what you're trying to be. And also, frankly, we were ambitious. We saw that this was going to be a really big thing for the Isle of Man. We really admired the Treasury Minister, Alan Bell, at the time for being brave enough to kind of go after it, get it slightly wrong initially, and then really get it right, get the regulations right, really get the positioning right. And we thought, right, we need to stand behind him, and we need to stand behind the government and support this industry.
It's perception thing still persists, I think. Occasionally you get family members or people who will just barge 2 feet first and start, railing at the gambling industry. What is it? What do you think it's about the sector that seems unable to get away from that? It does feel as if every news article that comes out, there's obviously a big subject, obviously, say European-wide around harm minimisation, etc. But it's consistent and it doesn't go away. What do you think the industry's got that puts it in that position?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if we look at other industries that you might draw parallels with, the alcohol industry being a particular one, because I remember when the Senate group was active in the industry, they recruited a couple of senior people from the Portman group who had done a really great job of repositioning alcohol in the minds of the public and the media. We seem to have really struggled with that as an industry, particularly in the UK, but actually generally in Europe. It does feel different when you get into the US, I think. The US are much more nuanced in their view, and they absolutely recognise that there is such a thing as a good gambler. I do think there's a big swathe of the media, certainly of politicians and of the public, and public health in particular, that have no recognition that there is such a thing as a good gambler, and that feels like a very harsh view of the industry. I mean, I don't know about you, I'm not a big gambler, really not interested in casino games, to be honest, perhaps lack of skill or something, but sports betting or I really enjoy.
Well, sports betting for me was always that thing I did on the way to the match on a Saturday. So before the online world came in, but it was always part of the experience. Now, I guess then, did it ever go too far? I'm like you, I'm just not a gambler. It's not something that really gets me going, but as part of a fun activity that was around, then I did that. I tend not to these days, and it's not because I'm in it. It's just because it's not the thing that gets me going. You still have that perception of the industry's out to rip you off one way or another, or that perception from outside of it. And it's fundamentally a different world from when you started. And certainly, so when I started, it is more of a tech industry, but yet it's interesting you mention the US, because you see it's more nuanced, but they do seem at this point to be pretty much charging down a road the mistakes that was made in Europe maybe 10 years ago, whether it be advertising, the lack of attention to harm minimization at this point. I'll very much look at the US and go, that needs to change pretty rapidly.
Yeah, and you're right, that is very disappointing, because I think the US have been keen since kind of reopening. They have been really keen to work and understand the European story. So I don't understand why they haven't been as keen to grasp it in that particular area, because they actually would have had the opportunity to really be groundbreaking, and seem to be woefully missing that.
Yep, no, but I think you look at it and go, they're going to learn quickly. They're probably going to get 10 years worth of changes in 18 months. And it's interesting now, I think, to see some of the new regulators in states over there are starting to do that. You see it elsewhere across the world. The Americans thing I've probably seen more in the last 3 months than the last 3 years of genuine attention to trying to protect players and look at minimise any harm that's out there. So, I mean, you've dealt with all the jurisdictions. What's the more interesting ones you've had to deal with? You mentioned the challenges around the island, sort of Gibraltar, Malta, etc. What do you think generally is going on across the world in the gambling side at the moment?
It's been interesting for the different island jurisdictions, even though Gibraltar would be keen to remind us that they're not actually an island. But and I always say maybe that's why they left the KPMG Islands group, because they'd had enough of being lumped in with all the other islands. But it's been interesting to watch the different islands kind of negotiate the kind of twists and tides of fortune, because Gibraltar in particular with Brexit, that was such a blow to them, and Malta benefited enormously from that blow to Gibraltar. Then when Malta was grey listed, probably the Isle of Man and Gibraltar benefited back, and now Gibraltar's going through its own challenges. So there's definitely a lot of outside influences on how those jurisdictions contend with the industry. But kind of globally, I think the challenges are very similar. Perception is always going to be a challenge. I think one thing is recognizing that there's only so much you can do to change that. That the public, like you, I get people that say, oh, you work with that industry, and who see it as really shocking, whereas I very strongly believe in people's personal rights and their rights to get their enjoyment, whether they want to go dancing or go drinking or have a flutter. It's people's rights to do that. They also have the right to be protected. But I do believe, and I know we hear about the awful cases where this doesn't happen, but I've never met an operator who doesn't wish to protect players and who doesn't see that the way to have a sustainable industry and a good industry is to have players who play healthily and happily for the long term. But that perception, I'm afraid, I don't think is ever going to change. However, my message always to operators and to the industry as a whole, you and I as providers, is the only way to address that to any level of success is working together. Doing it as individuals or individual operators doesn't impact at all.
It was noticeable when I joined the industry sort of 13, 14 years ago that this collaboration, we all talk about it a lot, just simply wasn't there. Yeah, they didn't. It was almost a perception that if somebody had said somebody was a problem gambler, it's a VIP, or there was just no trust. I think that is changing. I don't think it's changing quick enough. In my world, the sharing of data to better understand a customer and protect them is really almost the industry's being dragged into that area, whereas it happens in insurance, it happens in other areas. And yes, I know it is a slightly different area, but it feels as if the industry still, I think single customer view, I think self-exclusion, they're all bits that will bring the operators to the table, but it definitely feels like there's more willingness to at least share some of the processes and what they're doing.
And you mentioned self-exclusion, and to be honest, that's where I really saw it, because we worked with the sector on the NOSES exercise, as it was originally called, so looking to set up a national online self-exclusion system. And with the RGA, as it was at the time, Remote Gambling Association, and Clive Hawkeswood, we pulled together a working group from the operators to look at how are we going to do this. And long story short, it became GamStop and is being run very successfully by Fiona. But working with that working group over the course of the sort of year and a half that project went on was really interesting, because when they kind of first came into the room, and in those days it was literally into the room in 2016, then they almost had their cards close to their chest. People's body language was literally kind of self-protective, and I'm going to be very careful what I say here, and I'm not happy to share data, and anything that suggests we're sharing customer data would be completely unacceptable. And it was really interesting, and probably helped by the fact that it was in person and it was a relatively small group. I mean, sort of 10, 12, something like that. They really started to open up and learn from each other and enjoy learning from each other. And so, like you, I really hope that's going to continue to develop.
So look, I think just to finish off the sort of the sector that you and I, we've both been around. What's sort of been the biggest changes you've seen over the period you've been in? Because it is fundamentally different from when I started, and that was 2008, 2009.
Yeah, I think the industry has really changed for the better in many ways. I think it's harder to be a new operator now, and that's a shame. It's very hard to be a market entrant, but the maturity of the older operators and the older people in the sector, I think there really has been a sort of move away from any kind of Wild West or those real sort of edgy early days. I mean, Richard Schutz, the former California regulator, tells beautiful stories about Las Vegas and the mob, and this is why we really want to know who is who in the sector, because of those original sort of so it's come an awfully long way. And I think that's been really evidenced by the interest in the last couple of years in the whole ESG agenda for the sector, and how they've really grasped that. That's probably the majority of the conversations I now have with the people I know in the sector. And of course, I've known people like you for such a long time, and that's a wonderful thing.
I was going to ask you who the influential characters are, but Richard's just one of those interesting ones where he seems to be fully on board the diversity conversation, especially the gender diversity, and he's relentless on pushing back. Because I do feel in a land-based environment, there's still a representative number that are a bit old school, for want of a better expression. Richard's one of those that bucks that trend and is very much into the area you're into, and I'm into as well. But that's been the forefront of what you've done in the industry over the last few years. So to finish off sort of the gambling sector bit of it, tell us about the whole diversity aspect that you've seen change and what you're involved with now.
Yeah, I know. There's no doubt, as it has in the wider world, the sort of diversity element has shifted and got better. But I mean, when I first started talking about this in 2016, and there were probably two reasons why it happened then. One was I'd become a partner in 2015, which is what everybody's always aiming to in the profession. So you kind of feel like you've jumped over that final barrier. And I was the first female partner in the Isle of Man, and I became president of the Chamber of Commerce as the first female president in the Isle of Man. So I kind of felt like it was okay to talk about things now, because no one could accuse me of self-interest anymore. I'd kind of got where I wanted to be. But the other thing was that I'd pulled together a round table after the Isle of Man summit of senior women, being honest, because I didn't really have a topic for the round table, and I thought, oh, what shall I do? And there happened to be quite a few senior women in the Isle of Man at that point in the sector. And when I got them together in a room, I was just pretty horrified by what I heard about what their experience had been in the sector. And that was where the We All Want to Play initiative began. That I thought, right, this is the right time. This is the right sector. I'm going to start talking about this.
You mentioned we all want to play from the sector we're both in, but your interest and KPMG's interest are much wider than that sector. So talk to me generally around diversity? Because I tend to think we all talk about gender a lot, but whether that's education or age or social or whatever, just give us your views generally on where we are right now on the diversity issue.
It's really important to say, and that was sort of why we called it the We All Want to Play, because that initiative and my work more generally is absolutely aimed at diversity across all underrepresented groups. And there are so many underrepresented groups in the workforce. Gender is a really easy place to start. It's an easy place to start for me because I'm a woman, so I can represent women within the wider business world and at KPMG. But also, it's the area where we do gather data. And so we can very reliably report on what our actual performance is, whatever industry we look at or company we look at. So it's not a bad place to start. And a lot of, if you challenge unconscious bias in that area, then you start to open people's minds to their unconscious bias in other areas. I mean, KPMG in the UK, which, as you know, I've recently sort of joined from elsewhere in KPMG, they're very focused on social mobility and have been for some years. And I think in the UK, that's a really important area to be focused on. It's probably less important in somewhere like the US, where aspiration and the ability to kind of is nothing to do with class. It's all to do with attainment. So the US would be a very different environment. But here in the UK, that ability to take yourself from being a working class boy in the Northeast like my husband was to being high achieving in the corporate sector is pretty hard to do.
Well, and I come from the Northeast as well, and you sort of almost you get on your bike and you go somewhere else.
Sadly, that does seem to be what happens.
So is that changing now? I mean, I know it's a big focus for you. If KPMG put a focus on it, what are they doing to try and mitigate and move that?
Honestly, the truth is it isn't changing very quickly or very dramatically. It is talked about and recognised far more, but I still think there's a lot of barriers to change. And you know that when I present on this when I'm lucky enough to be asked to present on it at different events, I tend to talk about the barriers because I do think we've got to stop talking about the issue. Surely everyone recognises business case and you know why this is a good thing to do as well as the right thing to do, but we're not getting a huge amount in the way of outcomes. So I think companies have got to now start thinking about, okay, but what do I actually do? How do I change my processes? How do I change things so that we actually start to get more people up through the ranks?
No, I think, yeah, it's the practicalities of it, isn't it? So it's easy enough to tick a box and go, yeah, we're doing the right things. But if those stats that underlie that aren't changing, you know, people don't have social mobility. There is not a gender diversity. There's, you know, race, religion, whatever it might be. And the industry we work in definitely feels like, or certainly the online version of that, but generally across the board, do you think, I know they're not changing fast enough, but do you think they're changing?
I think the amount of airing that the topic gets is changing, has changed an awful lot. I mean, it was interesting for me recently. I just happened to watch the Paula Yates documentary that's been on and looking at, and I don't remember noticing this or caring about it at the time, being honest, looking at the way she was treated as a successful woman who just didn't give a damn and was happy to say what she wanted to do what she wanted. She was vilified. And the way she was treated when she went on programs like Have I Got News for You, which is a program I've always enjoyed, and you know that those guys are good fun. It was horrible the way they treated her. And similarly, I just watched the Pamela Anderson documentary about when she went to court about the sex tape that was stolen from them. She was treated appallingly in court, and that would never happen now. That's the thing that really comforted me, that absolutely would not happen now. So that has changed.
And maybe the fact you notice it. So certainly as a male, you look at it. And now I come at it from the prism of I've got a 12-year-old daughter and I see these things now. So the whole education of the biases that you have naturally within you. But you go back 10 years, bit longer, and you see stuff like that. It's pretty horrifying stuff. And it still goes on. But you look at any of the, say, the female sports stars where they are lauded one day and then criticised the next. Yeah, and then you add in the complexities of race into that, and people are treated so differently. Somehow for me, it just feels like we do what we can do now, but that next generation, you know, coming through are much more aware of this. And I think that's what might drag employers along the right path. because they're just not going to be able to recruit people if they don't have the same culture and ethics that they want.
I agree. I speak to my godsons. I don't have any children, but I speak to my godsons and their sisters, and they just don't appear to have bias. It's wonderful. They are just open to everything and everyone, and it sort of astonishes them. But I do think amongst our age group, and perhaps, some of the younger generation, but I think amongst our age group, one of the problems with the fact that we now talk about this a lot, and that actually behavior like some of the behavior we just talked about just wouldn't be tolerated in public, is that it can drive that sort of behavior and those conversations underground. And, let's be honest, the review of the Met Police indicates we're still a long way from this kind of thing being over. But the thing I really worry about is the fear it can create, because I think, men of your age and your colour have an enormous role to play, and you do choose to play it, and Richard Shoots chooses to play it, but other men will understandably be fearful of playing it, because as soon as you start talking about these things, you can get it wrong or be seen to get it wrong, and that's scary, understandably scary for a lot of people.
I think it's scary potentially scary on a number of levels. That's one. Another one about what you have to lose, and the job market and everything else. So I do think it's an age thing, and it is guys my age, and you look around going, they're the people. The younger generation will come through, and I think naturally, happily, will change things. But there's still a period of 10 years where there's people of a certain age are around. And one of the points I want to pick up on, because you mentioned it a lot, what do men have to, where's their role within this to help that culture change and to bring in, to sweep through a new broom? What do you think it's from a man's perspective, what they have to do?
I think it's really powerful when men talk about it, men who are in positions of power, who have had career success, who have nothing to gain and everything to lose, talk about it and genuinely care about it. And I think that's the key on outcomes. I don't think you get great outcomes from policies and procedures and practices. They're all good things and we should have them in place. But it's only really when people shift in terms of their heart. They see the injustice of inequality of opportunity. They see that it's wrong and they think, I want to change this. And things like reverse mentoring and having daughters, and that can really help with that. But if people have made that heart shift, then we've got to make it okay for them to talk about these things, to use the wrong words, to get things wrong, to not always get the nuance right. None of that matters. It's your intentions that matter. But sadly, all too often, it's the wrong word or the wrong gesture that gets honed in on, which is utterly meaningless.
No, I think it often comes across as just shutting down the argument. If you don't like the argument and somebody says the wrong thing, you just shut it down, by criticising that person or whatever. Whereas actually, educate us all, put us the right words. I had a similar, different thing completely, but similar thing with the US one where we were doing something for the tribal groups and I used the wrong expression. It happened to be, I used the way the market was doing a land grab, and you suddenly go, that's not the right phrase. But don't shut down the argument just because you've said the wrong thing. I think on the diversity front, we're going to come to sport in a second, but on the diversity, is there anything right now that should be the key focus in your mind, or KPMG's, or just generally across the workforce? Is there one area, or is it way too nuanced?
Certainly at KPMG, we have agreed a target for women in leadership, not a quota, but a target for women in leadership. And that's really helping to focus minds, because we haven't dictated a target. We've asked each of the firms right across the global network to say, what do you think is achievable for you by 2026? If you look at your pipeline, if we help you with this, if we help you with that, then what do you think is achievable? They've told us what they think is achievable. We've added up the figures and we said, right, we will have 33% women in leadership. And that means now we've said that publicly, we'll track against it. Each of the countries will track themselves against it. And that will really help. And I also think it really helps for women in the organisation hearing that and thinking, okay, you've recognised we don't have enough women in leadership, and you've publicly stated it and you've owned it and you've said you want to change it. And that helps us keep the women who we might otherwise lose, I think.
Yeah, I think monitoring and facts and figures, going back to what we said earlier on the other subject, is key. You've got to demonstrate what you're doing. We'll all talk about it. People like us will all agree with it, but actually change has got to happen. But what I did earlier, because we use the word legend too much, but when somebody's well known in an industry, you looked at, like I Googled living legend, and it's a person who was famous while still living, which is probably quite an important part, for doing something extremely well. Out of curiosity, what do you think you do well?
I think relationships, being honest. I think that's the thing that has sustained me, whether it's in my personal life, whether it's in my work life. Long term, really genuine, warm relationships that mean a lot to me and I hope mean a lot to the other people involved. When the pandemic started, I started doing what I called summit salons, where we just sort of got a group of 9 or 10 people together, or actually sometimes less, on a Teams call and just had a catch up, had a drink. And my criteria for inviting people is this is someone who, if I'd met them in the street prior to the pandemic, I would have hugged them. And this list of people, as I started to build it up, just got longer and longer. And they were all people from the industry. But yeah, I think there are so many people in my life that if I met them in the street, I would hug them.
As a parent, my kids, I can't help them with the applied mathematics. I can't help them with the Spanish, never mind anything else. But what I can help them with is their people skills. And I think that fits in with yours, which is, look, if you can look somebody in the eye, have a genuine conversation with them, don't particularly, and I know we're in a commercial roles in much of our working lives, but you don't have to get something back from it. If you're nice to somebody, you will generally get something back. It might not be right there, right then, but that ability to say, you know what, if it's like we all go around events, but there's a core of people you would quite happily have a beer with, whether you were there or not.
And I completely agree with you. I mean, you said, how do you feel about having sales in your title? And I must admit, that feels very commercial to me. But actually, I don't think anyone has any objection to commerciality. I think that's absolutely fine. But it's what you do for people when you're not going to get anything out of it that really matters to them. And I think that's always the key.
No, and I do think that you get those back over time. I think if you're just generally nice, people recognise you're not doing it just to get a deal or get a contract or whatever it might be, and help. Now, I've always done that, and I think it's a bit like somebody asked what I do. I'm this head of gaming. It's not commercial, but I do, like you, sit in a sales environment, but I do a bit more than that, but I don't approach it as that. And I think that's got me so far in the career, so it's not doing too badly at this point. So look, I'll finish off with a couple of things, which I'm more interested in, sort of about yourself. So Michelle, how are you and Micky? How are you and Micky? Because, I know about your alternative education and stuff, I've heard it before, but when was the change from Michelle to Micky then?
So my mum still laments about this, but it happened really early on, certainly before I went to school. And I'm not quite sure why it happened, but I've been Micky for so long. Well, you saw me laugh just then when you called me Michelle. All my email addresses are Micky in KPMG. They kind of have always recognized me as a Micky. And yeah, Michelle is just a name for when I'm in trouble, as far as I'm concerned. If my mum rings me and calls me Michelle, I know that there's a conversation about to happen. So yeah, always been a Micky. And it's funny that I picked, a name which is sort of gender neutral. Because certainly, before you could Google people, I would often turn up at a meeting and people would sort of say, well, I don't think Micky Swindale, or I don't think Micky Kelly, as it was, and don't think Micky Kelly's here yet. And I'd be like, well, actually, I am. So yeah, maybe that was unconsciously deliberate.
So they see a Micky Swindale on a list, and they're automatically in a high-powered job. The first thing is they're going to think it's a male. And then, as you say, that sort of slight role reversal to what would be perceived as the norm. Why can't that? Somebody's particularly good at their job, and that's where the career path is leading. Why wouldn't you? But that's part of the whole journey, I think, as a society we're on. We have to create that ability to do that.
And the good thing is, I think Paul really enjoys upsetting people's perceptions. I think it's a real pleasure for him. He's done it by doing what he's done to support me. He's done it in terms of his willingness to talk about his mental health issues. He did an article on LinkedIn probably around the time he stopped working. The amount of men that got in touch with him and said, thank you for saying this, thank you for telling us how you felt. That's got to have been a good 5 or 6 years ago. It was incredibly brave of him, and so I just think he's the trailblazer in many ways.
Well, it's the Isle of Man power couple.
I love it.
All right. Well, look, I really appreciate it. Thanks for your time. We'll get into all the other jobs you do another time. But for taking the time out, for speaking to us, for doing the whole gambling sector, diversity in sport, it's been great. Thanks again.
Thanks so much.